Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Star Trek Voyager Season 6. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review every episode of Star Trek Voyager one season at a time. This video is where I cover Season 6. So, for the purposes of this video, I'm assuming anyone watching has seen Season 6 of Voyager in its entirety and thus will not spend any time describing each episode and more of just give my opinion on what I think of each episode in Season 6. So, Season 6 is what I refer to as a schizophrenic season of Voyager. It's the season where episodes go from bad to good very quickly. It was a very hit or miss season. Therefore, for each episode, I'll say whether or not it is a hit or a miss. As each episode typically was either great or horrible, but there are a few exceptions. So that makes it kind of hard to judge Season 6 as a whole, but overall I would say it is a slight improvement over Season 5, but still doesn't come close to recapturing the greatness of Season 4. It seems to me, and this is pure speculation, that there must have been a lot of turmoil in the writing room, some writers pushing great episodes with other writers pushing horrible ones, and perhaps a lot of studio and executive interference preventing the writers from fully realizing the potential of certain stories. Whatever it was, the season is pretty unique in its ability to go from fantastic to terrible back and forth, and it's pretty unique in the Star Trek catalog in that way. So let's start with the premiere episode, Equinox Part 2, which is a miss. Now, I did a full-length review of this two-parter you can check out for more of my thoughts. And I mentioned in my Season 5 review how Part 1 of this was actually pretty good, but it was ruined by Part 2. Now, the cat and mouse chase between Voyager and the Equinox was suspenseful and interesting, but the ending kind of fizzled out. But more importantly, this episode was riddled with plot holes and inconsistencies. Now, I talked about most of these in my full-length review, but there are two major ones I want to mention here. First is Janeway acting completely out of character, where she goes all gung-ho on wanting to track Ransom down and kill him, and is willing to let anyone die who gets in her way. This, of course, is unacceptable behavior for a Starfleet captain. Oh, the irony. But when Chakotay tries to point this out, he's relieved of duty, and when Tuvok starts to question her behavior, she threatens to relieve him of duty as well. Not only is this completely and totally out of character for her, but it makes her come off as despicable. I was actually hoping that the crew was going to phaser her and throw her into the brig. Further, they kind of laugh and smile about it at the end of the episode, and everything goes back to normal, which is preposterous. Her unacceptable behavior should have had dire consequences in the social structure of the ship. And this episode also features what may be the biggest plot hole in all of Voyager, or at least one of the worst, and that's when Ransom turns the Doctor evil by deleting his ethical subroutines. The issue with this is that this instantly manufactures a devotion to Ransom that didn't exist before, which makes no sense. Just because the Doctor has no ethics doesn't change who he is, doesn't change who his loyalties are to, and the fact that 709 is his friend and Ransom is a stranger. So, in short, Ransom deleting his subroutines should have turned the Doctor into Ransom's worst nightmare, where he would have no compunction about killing him in the worst possible way for harming his friends. It was such a contrived and sloppy bit of writing, it's impossible for me to look past that when watching this episode. Also, I do have to mention the missed opportunity where the episode ends with the survivors of the Equinox coming aboard Voyager, and Janeway gives them a speech about how they all have to work hard to earn the crew's respect. And then we get an ongoing story for the rest of the season that explores these crew members trying to assimilate into Voyager and this fascinating new dynamic that this brings to the ship. Just kidding. We never see or hear from any of these people again. The reset button strikes hard. But anyway. So, next episode is Survival Instinct, and this is a hit. This is one of the few Borg episodes after Dark Frontier, and really perhaps the only one that is good. As I mentioned, Dark Frontier was a horrible episode that ruined the Borg so much, so most of the Borg episodes that come after it totally sucked. However, this one is different because it doesn't deal with the main Borg storyline or the Borg Queen going Janeway or anything like that. It more covers Seven of Nine's backstory and brings up a very interesting concept. So it jumps back and forth between Seven, when she was a Borg being stranded on this planet, to the present times where Voyager has an open door policy at a trading outpost where those same three people are no longer drones approach Seven of Nine. And I think the structure of this story works really well. At first we have no idea what's going on. But information of this is disseminated in a very effective fashion. And overall, this is a great character story for Seven that really explains how her experiences with the Borg was different because she was assimilated at such a young age, which is why she reacted on the planet the way she did, and her reaction had dire consequences for the three other drones who did become free from the collective but were trapped in this endless triad instead. And seeing these scenes play out on the planet worked so well and made for some amazing drama. And this all ended with an amazing moral dilemma where Seven is stuck with sending them back to the Borg or separating them from each other finally, but doing so would leave them with only a month to live, and she chose the latter option, which just made for amazing drama. So all in all, I'd say this is one of the better episodes of the entire show and a rare example of Voyager getting the Borg right in the later seasons. I'm sure this had something to do with the fact that this was written by Ronald D. Moore, one of the most noteworthy writers from Next Generation and Deep Space Nine, who went on to become the showrunner for Battlestar Galactica. He came on board as a writer on Voyager for Season 6 after Deep Space Nine finished, and only stayed for 2 episodes because of the vast disagreements between him and head writer Brennan Braga. In fact, it is said that Moore quit in anger, and the disagreement nearly ended his long-term friendship with Braga. The disagreements are said to be born out of Moore's wanting to push the show in a different direction and introduce long-term story arcs that would change the nature of the show, which Braga was extremely resistant to. And I can only imagine how much better the last 2 seasons of Voyager would have been had Moore been allowed to do what he wanted to do. But at least we got this one episode out of it, and which is one of his best works. So next we get Barge of the Dead, which Ronald D. Moore has a story credit for rather than a written by credit for, and this episode is a big fat miss. This episode is horrible. I believe it will be a strong contender for my top 10 worst Voyager episodes. What can I say? This episode is ridiculous. The story about B'Elanna going to the Klingon purgatory to prevent her mother from going to Klingon hell, which when she gets there it looks just like Voyager. This episode is really painful to watch. So after that is Tinker Tenure Dr. Spy, which is a big hit. I did a full-length review for this episode if you want to hear more of my thoughts on this. I also ranked this as the second funniest episode in the Star Trek franchise, a rating I stand firmly behind. This episode only isn't hilarious, which it is because it has one effective funny gag after another, but in a rare case of Star Trek comedy episode, it actually has a cohesive plot. That actually makes sense and at times is somewhat engaging and suspenseful in its own right. A rarity in Voyager. I mean, this is just an amazing Doctor episode that explores his character as he strives to become more. That opening scene where the Doctor is singing when Tuvok breaks out into punk far and the Doctor incorporates this into his opera song is absolute comedy gold and bar none the funniest moment in the entire show. Tuvok, I understand, you are a Vulcan man. You have just gone without for 7 years about. Paris, please find a way to load the hyperspray. I'll give you the sign, just aim for his behind. Sorry you had to endure my singing, but it's just so funny. I love that. I sing that to myself all the time. It's pure comedy gold. And it's not just that the episode remains humorous throughout. It's this hierarchy aliens are actually an interesting alien introduction to the Voyager catalog. So overall, this is a really great episode. So, next episode is Alice, which is a miss. It's funny, so far it's been consistently switching back from hit and miss. Anyway, I will admit, watching this episode again, I realized it wasn't as bad as I remember it being, but still, it's bad. When it comes down to it, this is just a crappy remake of Stephen King's classic novel Christine, but with a spaceship instead of a car. I mean, they do change things up a bit by having it, have an interface that scans Tom's brain and creates an image of the idea of his idea of the perfect woman, and actually talks to him. But it's basically the same thing, where there's a spaceship comes alive, it tries to kill B'Elanna and brainwashes Tom. It's not the worst thing in the world, but ultimately a waste of time. Okay, we continue the switchback, and the next episode is Riddles, which is a hit. Now, I mentioned this episode a lot in the review I did for the episode Tuvix, which I cannot stand that episode if you don't know, because I think this is the better version of Tuvix, as it presents a dilemma as it should be presented as a new version of Tuvok refusing surgery because he doesn't want to go back to the person he used to be. He doesn't go around screaming, "I want to live!" Nor do they call this murdering the new Tuvok. They tell it as it is, something that Tuvix couldn't do right. Not only that, but this episode actually knows what type of episode it is and remains consistent in tone as it keeps up the light tone even through the moments of suspense, and it doesn't drop into silly melodrama like Tuvix did. And this is probably the best example of Tuvok and Neelix's relationship, as it starts with Tuvok being a dick to Neelix, like he always is, but when Tuvok becomes a new person, Neelix goes out of his way to look after him, and thus they form a strong bond, which I totally bought, and I thought it was crafted beautifully. And so when Tuvok was told he has to go surgery to go back to the person he used to be, he doesn't want to, because he doesn't want to be a dick to Neelix again and wants to be his friend. But Neelix sacrifices his new friend in order to allow Tuvok to live up to his full potential. It's actually a very powerful, touching story, and the little coda at the end where Tuvok, after he goes back to being a dick to Neelix, but he answers his riddle in a non-logical fashion, which was a nice little coda. So overall, I'd say this is one of the better episodes of Season 6, and overall a very touching episode. So next episode is Dragon's Teeth, and this is actually a rare episode in Season 6 that's neither a hit nor miss. In fact, I've always had trouble figuring out what to make of this episode. It's fine, it's fine, I guess. It always seems incomplete somehow, but not in a way that ruins the episode, because it does tell a complete story. There just isn't much to it, and it feels like there should be more to it. And apparently this was originally meant to be a two-parter, but was then condensed into one episode, and it shows. However, I think the biggest offense of this episode is that it sets up this villain, the Vaadwaur, and other races like the Teray, who could have been long-term reoccurring aliens that could have made the show interesting, but we never see either of them ever again. At the end of the episode, Janeway even has a line saying, "Well, I suspect we haven't seen the last of the Vaadwaur." Wrong again, Janeway, because you never see them again. It makes this episode an anomaly and kind of unremarkable, but I like I said, it's not a bad episode, just kind of meh. And something I didn't notice until recently is the actor who plays Teabag from Prison Break is the actor playing the main asshole Vaadwaur in this episode. That guy always does villains well, but I didn't recognize him at first through all that makeup. So overall, this episode is very middle of the road. So next is One Small Step, which is a huge miss. I had always considered this whenever doing one of my worst lists, but watching it again, I realized this isn't offensively bad. It's just boring and dull as hell. In fact, I would say it's boring episodes like these that try to focus more on modern day astronauts that inspired the first 2 seasons of Enterprise that likewise was dull and boring as hell. The bulk of this episode was about Chakotay's obsession with his hero and how he put the away team at risk because of it, and I have to say that was pretty dumb. So overall, not a good episode. Next is the Voyager conspiracy, which is another miss. Now, this episode was a very obvious PSA against conspiracy theories and not much more than that. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not a huge advocate of conspiracy theories. Many are misguided and misleading, and some, in my opinion, are outright dangerous. But I can find a bit of irony in the way this episode dismisses the whole idea of them, mainly because of how drastically this contrasts with one of my favorite Voyager episodes, Remember, where B'Elanna uncovered an alien conspiracy that covered up a genocide of an entire peoples whose race was killed off out of bigotry. But when she brought up to these aliens, it was dismissed as a conspiracy theory. But the point of that episode was that things aren't always what they appear to be. But the point of this episode is things always are what they appear to be, basically. So it's about Seven being overloaded with too much information from the ship that comes all at once. So she comes up with all these insane conspiracy theories. First about Janeway involving in some Federation Cardassian conspiracy. And then about some Maquis conspiracy theory, but both theories were utterly absurd, and I don't buy for a single second that either Janeway or Chakotay would buy them as much as they did in this episode. Plus, it personally annoys me that Seven comes across an image of a Cardassian ship in the Delta Quadrant, and this is just dismissed as nonsense. I'm sorry, but that actually means something. But anyway, this episode is stupid. The resolution of Janeway quoting stardates the way Seven was doing to prove she really cares about her was dumb. This episode is just a mess. So next is Pathfinder, and I'm going to call this episode a hit, but not as big of a hit as is generally given credit for, as I see it pop up on the occasional top 10 or top 20 list, and I personally don't think it belongs there at all, and I would equate calling this one of Voyager's best episodes with calling Trials and Tribulations one of Deep Space Nine's best episode, or even calling These Are the Voyages one of Enterprise's best episodes, in the regard that it isn't really a Voyager episode, not in the classic sense. That's not a knock against this episode, but for me, this instantly disqualifies it from being considered one of Voyager's best. And besides, while I did find this episode enjoyable, there's nothing about it I find particularly great. People tend to flock to these crossover episodes and give them more credit than they deserve. That being said, it was really interesting to get this alternative perspective of what it was like in the Alpha Quadrant side while they search for Voyager, and I actually think making Barclay the central character in this regard was a very good decision. And although there were a few things about this episode I find a bit hokey, overall I think it works and tells an interesting character story with Barclay with a very satisfying payoff for the show overall. So next episode is Fairhaven, and boy, is this ever a miss. Now, there have been much debate and discussion over which episode is worse, this episode or its sequel, Spirit Folk. The general consensus seems to be that Spirit Folk is worse. In fact, some would even go as far to say that this episode isn't really bad, it's just Spirit Folks that's bad. I always hated both episodes, but as to which one was worse, I let myself be convinced by the crowd that Spirit Folk was worse. I particularly avoided rewatching both of these episodes, so I couldn't really remember which one was worse. But after rewatching both episodes and sort of analyzing them, I can definitively say that this episode is worse. Far be it for me to go against the crowd, and don't get me wrong, both episodes are horribly bad, and both are strong contenders for my top 10 worst episodes, but as silly as Spirit Folk is, at least it has somewhat of an interesting plot and moments of suspense, moments of engagement, but this episode doesn't have any of that. Proponents of this episode claim it to be a character story as it's about Janeway's need for perfection and to meddle with things as she keeps changing the parameters of the holographic character in order to make him the perfect man. But I'll have to be honest, this character story sucks. It wasn't executed very well. Like, it's hard to know exactly what they were trying to say, as, this is, after all, just a hologram. I heard the comparison made to a video game, so basically she's changing the parameters to suit her of a game. What's wrong with that? The whole side story with Michael Sullivan, going mad when Janeway leaves him was dumb. So I'm sorry, this episode is worse than Spirit Folk because the whole thing is just painful to watch, and it's not just bad like Spirit Folk is, but it's also boring. God damn, I cannot stand this Irish pub town and the way the character. I can't stand this episode. So this is actually a very strong contender for my number 1 worst episode slot of the entire show. So next episode is Blink of an Eye, and this is exactly what I'm talking about with Season 6. This is probably the prime example of how bipolar this season is. We go from one of the all-time worst episodes of the entire show straight into one of the all-time best episodes of the entire show. So yes, this is a hit. This episode is generally rated as one of the best episodes of Voyager and is the highest rated episode of Voyager on IMDb. It was also a personal favorite of mine too, as it's a fascinating story that spans centuries on a planet while Voyager only lasts a few days. I love how we get different scenes from the planet played by different actors over different time periods. This was a bold decision as these scenes take place completely independent of Voyager and are pretty much self-contained vignettes, but they all work together to illustrate how Voyager's presence affected this planet and was integrated into their mythology. And it was amazing seeing Voyager's reaction when they learned of this, and the ending where they actually get to meet an astronaut from the planet below was fascinating, and the resolution was truly exciting. This is overall a very well executed and fascinating episode. I probably wouldn't go as far as to say this was the number 1 best episode of Voyager because it doesn't pack quite the emotional punch as some of these other episodes like Year of Hell or Drone does, but it still has some great character moments as well as telling an incredibly intriguing story. The side story where the Doctor visits the planet and returns after 4 years, what is 4 years for him, but just a few minutes on Voyager, and he returns and reportedly he has a son named Jason. That is a fascinating story in its own right, and I wish someone would write a book or something explaining his time on the planet and how this happened. I heard one critic refer to the storyline as tacked on and unnecessary, but I could not disagree more. It adds so much to the texture and richness of the mythology of the episode, and I personally find it fascinating, and it really piques my interest. I heard others criticize this episode for being remarkably similar to a classic science fiction novel called Dragon's Egg, but I think that the term rip-off is too strong of a term. It just takes inspiration from it. It has, in fact, a lot of Star Trek episodes do. It's different and unique enough to be its own story. In fact, I even go as far as to say that calling this episode a rip-off of Dragon's Egg is like calling Groundhog's Day a rip-off of the Next Generation episode Calls in Effect. Just because it's about the same concept doesn't mean it's a rip-off. But regardless, I do think this episode is a blaring achievement in Voyager that tells the fascinating character-based weird sci-fi stories that Star Trek was created for, so definitely a highlight for the entire series. So after that, we get Virtuoso, which is a miss. I've done a full-length review of this episode if you want to hear more of my thoughts on this episode. I'm still kind of in awe that they even go as far to do an episode where the Doctor becomes an opera star. The whole idea is ludicrous, and it's kind of amazing that they actually went ahead and did it. Although the episode isn't quite as silly as its premise, in fact, the episode's biggest flaw is that it takes itself too seriously. There are a few funny moments in there here and there, like it cracks me up every time when the aliens are speaking really slowly to the Doctor because they think he's too dumb to understand, and he responds by doing the same thing to them. But for the most part, this episode is rather dull and the jokes fall really flat. It degrades into a stereotypical story warning of the fleetingness of fame and how fickle fame is. It actually reminds me a lot of the Simpsons episode where Bart becomes famous by saying, "I didn't do it." So in other words, it's kind of a cliched and boring story. The one episode saving grace, though, is the emotional impact of the scene where the Doctor sings his final opera after realizing he's been replaced by another hologram, where you can hear the sorrow in his voice as he was actually in love, and to have that love brushed aside so casually was really heartbreaking, and I think Robert Picardo plays that really well. So this isn't a completely horrible episode, but overall not a really good one either. So next episode is Memorial, which is a hit. Now, this is a controversial episode because many question Janeway's decision to repair the memorial and leave it functioning. However, I did a full-length review on this episode where I completely tackled this subject, which I do believe you need a big chunk of time to tackle, as it is a complex subject, so I won't attempt to get into that here. So if you want to hear my thoughts on that, you can check out that full review. Suffice to say, I agreed with her decision and further loved this episode as it was a very powerful statement about how those who forget history are doomed to repeat it, and the importance of remembering history. And the whole structure of this episode, where the mystery of what's really going on is built up to slowly, was extremely well done to maximize interest. And the powerful character stories it told along the way were completely brilliant, making this one of the better episodes of the entire show. So, next episode is the one where Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson appears. I mean, the Rock episode, which I guess is officially referred to as Zunkatsi, but no one really thinks of it that way. It's the Rock episode. And this, by the way, is a miss. Now, even though The Rock only appears in one scene in this episode, it was obvious that the whole episode was constructed on having a guest appearance from a known wrestler. And it should be noted that this episode came out before Dwayne Johnson became a huge movie star. In fact, I think this was The Rock's first acting performance outside of wrestling, so he was known as just a wrestler at the time. Now, it should be noted that this was part of a promotion UPN was running, because other than Voyager, UPN's most popular show at the time was the WWE wrestling show. So in order to promote that and to promote UPN's other shows to wrestling fans, it ran a promotion that week where pretty much every episode on UPN featured a guest appearance from a wrestler. Most other shows on UPN were sitcoms, which was easier to just pop in a wrestler appearance. For a sci-fi drama show that was set in the future and filmed far in advance, it was considerably harder, but it appeared UPN insisted Voyager participate in this week. So it's beyond apparent to me that the writers were given an order to incorporate a wrestler into an episode. So they specifically came up with the story in order to do so. And I commend them for their efforts, but the story is kind of bland. It's kind of obvious that the concept was forced upon them rather than being a story they wanted to tell. The Rock's appearance only takes up a scene and isn't all that integral to the plot. That has more to do with the actor who played General Martok on Deep Space Nine, playing a Herodian who mentors Seven of Nine to become a fighter and ends up being her opponent in a death match that he wants to lose. This story felt incredibly rushed and incomplete, and ultimately this episode is forgettable, so as I said, miss. So next episode is Collective, and this is another one of those rare examples in season 6 where I can't tell if it's a hit or miss, and it's kind of in between. In fact, for the most part, I have a hard time telling whether or not I like this episode. It's somewhat interesting. I mean, the scenes where the away team get abducted by the Borg is scary enough. It was an interesting twist to find out the Borg were all children, but for the most part this episode is dull and not that remarkable, as it degrades into a typical story of one hothead leader being a dick to the others that don't really want to follow him. I know they were trying to tell a character story with 7 of 9 reconnecting with her past as she was assimilated as a child, so she has to deal with assimilated children, but frankly I don't think they did that good of a job at it. Not a terrible one, but not a great one either. I was really surprised when the surviving Borg children in this episode became reoccurring characters later on, as I assumed, just like the Equinox crew and all the other characters we've seen before in one episode, that they would just disappear and never be mentioned again. And frankly, I would have much preferred the Equinox crew become reoccurring characters rather than these Borg children, but the show apparently wanted to play more on the family demographics, so we get these children instead. I will admit Ichab was an interesting enough addition to the crew, but still I'm not overly attached to this storyline. Okay, so next episode is Spirit Folk, which is very clearly a miss. I mentioned this episode earlier, as along with Fairhaven makes up Season 6 lame attempt to create a new holodeck program that the crew goes to hang out in, and this was absolutely horrible. Now, as I said, I actually think Fairhaven was worse because it was more boring and thus more painful to watch. In fact, the fact that this episode is so outrageously dumb makes it actually more fun to watch. But like many holodeck episodes, the plot was very contrived and there were many easy solutions that were either overlooked or dismissed with a single line of dialogue that was nothing more than an excuse to keep the paper-thin plot going. The whole concept that the holodeck could malfunction in such a way to allow the holodeck characters to be aware of things that they shouldn't be aware of was far-fetched, and some of these scenes were in fact very painful to watch. So another horrible episode. So after that we get Ashes to Ashes, which I'm going to have to call a miss. Or a better way of stating it would to give this episode an A for effort. Nice try, better luck next time. The concept was good, but the execution left a lot to be desired. I know this may be me and my continuity hound tendencies coming out again, but I find it way too hard to believe that there was this ensign on Voyager who was friends with Harry Kim since the Academy days, who died a few years ago, who Harry pretty much was in love with, that we've never ever seen or heard mention of before. Now come on, there's suspension of disbelief, and then there's treating your audience like idiots. Now I do like the concept of an alien that reverts the dead of other species into their own, and I like the character journey Ballard goes on while she's there, which is why I say this is a good effort. But the whole story falls apart when trying to keep it in the overall context of Voyager. One very easy fix would have been, instead of inventing a new character that never existed, use an existing one, such as Ensign Jatal from the episode Latent Image, who in herself was invented for that episode, but was established as having a friendship with the crew as they had a birthday party for her, and it was her death that we're already familiar with, and she was actually shown as to being friends with Ensign Kim as well, so that would make perfect sense. So we'd feel more connection to this character rather than a new character that just popped up out of nowhere and is hard to believe ever existed. However, that wouldn't negate another huge issue with the premise of this episode, and that's Voyager has been constantly moving towards Earth, and it has in fact made several huge jumps towards Earth, including a journey in the Slipstream Drive and Timeless, and a huge jump in the catapult in the Voyager conspiracy, meaning anyone who died over a year ago should be decades journey away from Voyager at this time. So this episode is dumb. Sorry. So next episode is Child's Play. And I'm actually going to call this a hit. Even though I wasn't the biggest fan of the Borg children's storyline, I found this entry a particularly interesting one. I love how it retroactively explains where the pathogen that disabled the Borg ship and collective came from, and it tied in nicely into the current storyline with the Borg children, and it was a great character story for Seven, who had become attached to the Borg children as a mother figure, having to give up Ichab to his real parents only to learn that her suspicions about them were correct and their intentions were in fact foul. In fact, I like the whole storyline of the less advanced race who is under constant threat from the Borg using genetics rather than weapons to fight the Borg, and the moral implications of using their own children as weapons was powerful and brought up great analogies to like suicide bombers or even child soldiers and doing what's necessary for the survival of one's entire species. I know many may see Echab's parents as evil, but I think the situation was presented as more nuanced than that, and that through the episode you can actually see their point of view even if you disagree with their ultimate decisions, which is what makes this episode so powerful. So ultimately, it's another good episode. So next episode is Good Shepherd, which is a miss. This is Voyager's second attempt at doing a lower decks type episode, and like the first one, Learning Curve, it fails miserably. This is an interesting premise, but it's executed so poorly. Personally, I think this, hate to keep going back to this, but this should have been about the Equinox crew survivors and Janeway trying to integrate them into the crew, but I guess it's too much to expect Voyager to keep any level of consistency. Instead, we get introduced to these characters we've never seen before who were supposed to have been on Voyager from the very start that aren't fitting in well, and the senior officers are finally deciding to do something about this 6 freaking years later. But more than that, I found the whole structure of the episode to be half-assed and cliche, and while Mortimer Heron is an interesting enough character, the other misfits are just walking, talking cliches. William Tefler is the hypochondriac cliche, and Tal Celeste is just the incompetence cliche, and the actual story of the dark matter creatures, or whatever the hell, and that Janeway and the Misfits encounter is just another bland spatial anomaly BS that's typically done in the B story. And more to the point, this episode has no real resolution and just seems to abruptly end, making me wonder what the hell the point of this entire episode was, making this episode a total and complete mess. So next we get into Live Fast and Prosper, which I'm going to have to say is a miss, but not a horrible one. This is mostly a silly episode about a group of con artists that pose as Voyager as they swindle people and Voyager gets the blame. This was somewhat interesting, entertaining episode, but ultimately the silly premise doesn't really go anywhere, and the side storyline of Paris and Neelix thinking they still have it as they try to con the Doctor was dumb, as was the attempts of humor with the con artists themselves, as that one guy who's playing Tuvok constantly threw himself into the role a bit too much, but I do admit that was a bit amusing at times. The main plot was kind of bland, so this episode is pretty forgettable. Okay, so next we get into Muse, which is another miss, a long run of misses. This episode is horrible. This is just horrible, as it makes up some stupid shuttle crash excuse to have a dumb episode where somehow, they make a Shakespearean type play out about Voyager for the purposes and reasonings that is ridiculously contrived and executed in a mind-numbingly dumb way. I will admit I had only seen this episode once or twice before because I always avoided it because it sucks, but watching it all the way through recently, I'm convinced more than ever that this is one of the worst episodes of Voyager, and this is exactly what I'm talking about with Season 6. This season has a lot of the best episodes of the entire show, while at the same time having a lot of the worst episodes of the entire show. I mean, the whole thing about showing a play to convince a warlord to pursue peace was such a fake and flimsy part that holds no basis in reality, and the whole plot of the episode was just a piss poor excuse to turn the story of Voyager into some sort of mythology done in the form of a Shakespearean type play that was just god awful. So next episode is Fury, which is another miss. Boy, the later half of the season is really fumbling. Although I will say this isn't a good episode, I don't think it's quite as bad as it's generally viewed to be, as this is at the bottom 10 worst episodes on IMDb and is generally considered one of the worst episodes of Voyager. I even say it's that bad. I call it more averagely bad. The most blatant and obvious blunder of this episode is turning Kes into a villain, and the fact that she, that this step in her character makes no sense for her overall character arc. I heard it once described beautifully as if yesterday's Enterprise was a way to bring back Tasha Yar after a horrible send-off that didn't work, and send her off in a really great way that does work and work for her character. This episode is the exact opposite of that, as the gift was the perfect way to send off Kes, and then they bring her back to send her off in a horrible way. This whole excuse about her going crazy and thus wanting to travel back in time to kill the Voyager crew in the most horrible way is unbelievable, to say the least. It completely destroys her character. And since that is the heart of this episode, it does make the episode bad. However, the reason why I say this episode is just averagely bad and not one of the worst of the entire show is that the concept of going back to the events of the first season to show the events that occurred off screen during the first season and bring back the Vidines as the main adversary was a very interesting one. I love how this was executed, as it was a way for the show to reconnect to its roots, which I love, and how it makes a point to point out the differences between what the show was and what it's become now worked really well. And as far as them destroying Kes's character, I think they did negate that a little bit by having Season 1 Kes be the ultimate way they resolved the situation, as she's able to bring future Kes back to reality to the way she used to be, which I did think was a powerful way to resolve this story. Now, it's said about this episode that Rick Berman had the idea to bring Kes back for an episode, and when the actress agreed, the writers were put to a task of writing an episode worthy of her return, i.e. that centered on her, and they came up with this. And I think it shows they are purposely trying to write a Kes episode, whereas yesterday's Enterprise wasn't all about Yar coming back. It wasn't a Yar episode. It was an interesting story in its own right, but it made sense for the story to have Yar reappear, which is why that episode worked and this one didn't. In fact, there had been many episodes, none of the least being Year of Hell, where it would have made a lot more sense to have Kes return, but she's nowhere to be found. And in that sense of being more natural, would have worked so much better. And plus, I can understand how much this episode ruins her perfect send-off in the gift by showing her go mad and just wanting to go home. So not a good episode at all, but I don't think it's one of the worst. So next episode is Lifeline, and I know this is going to be unpopular, but I'm going to say this is a miss. This is a very well-liked episode. I've seen it in quite a few top 10 lists. But I have to be honest, I don't like this episode, and I never did. First and foremost, I just find it annoying. It's kind of a ripoff of the TNG episode Brothers, where Data meets his creator, Dr. Noonien Soon, and Brent Spiner plays both parts. But here, the Doctor meets his creator, Louis Zimmerman, and Robert Picardo gets to play both parts. Except, for some reason, Robert Zimmerman is now very old with gray hair, whereas we've seen him portrayed both in Projections and the Deep Space Nine episode Dr. Bashir, I presume, as being the same age that the Doctor appears to be. Not is, but appears to be, as their appearances were exactly the same, but now, all of a sudden, Zimmerman looks much older. I wonder what caused him to age so rapidly. Did he go through a wormhole? Did he contract the disease from the deadly years? Or did the writers just fucking suck at keeping continuity? Somehow, I think it's the third option, but not only do they suck, it's obvious that they just don't fucking care. So why should I care about anything that they do with this character? Regardless, I find this story far-fetched to say the least. And all of a sudden, Lieutenant Barclay is Zimmerman's best friend. Boy, it's funny how he pops up wherever the plot requires him to, and when Zimmerman is dying, he comes up with this far-fetched plan to send the Doctor all the way from the Delta Quadrant back to Earth or Jupiter Station, as the case may be, to save his life. And when he gets there, Zimmerman treats him like shit until we get this catharsis realization that Zimmerman is ashamed that all the EMH Mark 1s have his face are used to scrub plasma. First of all, I think the whole plasma scrubbing plot line is ridiculous and not practical. Why don't they just create new holograms? It doesn't really make any sense. But more importantly, I find this so-called character story fake, unbelievable, and entirely contrived. And I do not buy this whole sending the Doctor to the Alpha Quadrant to treat one person at all. Yes, I know Zimmerman is a father figure to him, but nah, bullshit. Don't buy it. And the episode itself is just Zimmerman being a dick and yelling. It gives me a headache to watch this episode. You know, don't get me wrong, I don't hate this episode entirely. There are some interesting and funny character moments, but overall I just see it as a pretentious failure. Now, next episode is The Haunting of Deck 12, which may surprise some, but I'm actually going to go ahead and call it a hit. A tentative one, but a hit no less. I never looked too kindly on this episode in the past, as I find the whole premise of Neelix telling ghost stories to the Borg children to be a bit ridiculous. And some of the contrived ways they try to make this a typical children's scary movie is a bit ridiculous and cheesy, but the actual story of an alien taking over the ship and threatening everyone's lives was actually compelling, and the story does actually manage to be scary from time to time, such as having the alien communicate to Janeway through using the computer voice was actually very effectively creepy, and the way Janeway stood up to it, even when she could have died, was actually a great character moment for Janeway. So overall, I wouldn't call this a great episode, but there was enough good things where I think I could overall refer to it positively. So finally, we come to the season finale, Unimatrix 0 Part 1, and this is a big, fat miss. There are still some who like this episode, but generally speaking, this episode is looked on more negatively. In fact, one reviewer once stated that this was one of the worst Voyager episodes, while at the same time calling Dark Frontier one of the best. Honestly, I think Dark Frontier is worse than this two-parter, but still this two-parter is not good. It continues that cartoonification and utter destruction of the Borg on Voyager that began in Dark Frontier, where the Borg Queen acts like a Scooby-Doo villain that says Janeway all the time. And this episode also comes up with a contrived way to introduce a Borg romance in Seven of Nine's past. Sigh, eye roll, sigh, and whatnot. But the one thing about this episode I will give it over Dark Frontier is at least it didn't try to rewrite the past in ludicrous ways, and it doesn't have the Borg acting like silly James Bond villains that come up with overly complicated ways to assimilate Earth when all they need to do is send a freaking fleet there. But it does come up with this irrelevant storyline about Unimatrix 0, which I can tell will be irrelevant, won't have anything to do with anything in the future, but I'll get more into that when I cover part 2, and also a fake cliffhanger that we know is all part of Janeway's plan anyway, so not a good episode. So that's it. That's all the episodes of Season 6. So now let me get into the best and worst episodes of the season, starting with my pick for worst episode of Season 6. As I said, there are a lot of strong choices here. There's Barge of the Dead, One Small Step, The Voyager Conspiracy, Spirit Folk, Good Shepherd, Muse, and Unimatrix 0. But I'll have to go with Fairhaven as the worst episode of Season 6. This episode was painful to watch, painfully dull, painfully boring, painfully stupid, and just pointless and horribly written. I have no idea what the hell the writers were thinking on this one. So, as for my pick for best episode of Season 6, as I said, there were a lot of options for this pick. 2 episodes that include Survival Instinct, Tenur, Dr. Spy, Riddles, and Memorial, but I think I'll have to go with Blink of an Eye, a true achievement for Season 6, a fan favorite for good reason, as it takes risks, something that Voyager often doesn't do, by featuring vignettes of different stories taking place on the planet over centuries that tell a story of how Voyager got integrated into its mythology, and when the two finally meet up, it's immensely satisfying to see the friendship that builds there. A fascinating story and a real feel-good episode, definitely one of the show's best. So as for my rating for Season 6 as a whole, out of 10, I'll give this a 7 very good. As I said, a very bipolar season that goes from one of the best episodes ever to one of the worst episodes ever, and it does have a good run of episodes and a run of bad episodes towards the end of the season. And the fact this season features some of the best episodes of the entire show, and can also turn out some many high quality episodes to off-put its horrible ones, it does mean a lot. So I think the season is a prime example of having good writers that wanted to do good but are being held back by an executive branch that interfered too much, or at least that's how it appears to be to me. All in all, not a bad entry into the Voyager mythology with some really great contributions. So that's it for my review of Star Trek Voyager Season 6. I'll be back in about a month to review Season 7 of Voyager. And in the meantime, I do episode reviews from all 5 Star Trek series as determined by my user polls, which you can check out my most recent episode review to vote on which episode I'll review next in the latest poll. I also do videos on many other shows like Game of Thrones, The Expanse, Mr. Robot, and more, so be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all that. Thanks a lot for watching.